So, thank you all for staying this afternoon. I imagine that you're all here because you're here and interested in groundwater, and so I have to apologise to you that this isn't really a groundwater presentation, but there wasn't a category for trees when I filled out my NRM conference application, so I ticked groundwater and here I am. So we go down, there we go. So trees. In the arid zone, South Australia, there aren't a whole lot of trees. When you head off on a field trip from Coober Pedy, there's a lot of this sort of a landscape. It might be varied with a little bit of undulations and a few scraggly, scrubby things hanging out in some of the gullies. And then every now and again you might cross through a bit of a dip and you might see some widely spaced eucalypt trees, and these are the floodplains there. And this is a coolabah growing on the floodplain, which occupies a sort of a similar niche that the black box trees occupy for the River Murray. And along the watercourses, quite often large trees and quite high density trees. River red gums there, it's a different variety, but it's the same species as occurs down here. And what we're looking at here is when we drive through these seem like little pockets of trees, but actually this is a huge big connected forest running through the along the rivers and floodplains that exist in these regions. At this point here, there we are, that little red dot up there, that's 2.5 kilometres wide. So there's a big woodland out there that's 2.5 kilometres wide, hundreds of kilometres long, connected to all these other areas. And there's great big trees out there with big hollows, big nesting sites that is completely unique from the surrounding landscape. And yet there's very little known about what sort of vegetation grows. So if you want to look up where do the red gums grow as opposed to where do the coolabahs grow, this data doesn't tell us anything. In terms of what fauna species occupy these areas, there's very little data too. Most of the fauna surveys are focused on the surrounding more desert landscapes. There's also very limited knowledge about whether they are groundwater dependent. It's been assumed that they probably are, and if they are, what are the characteristics of that groundwater? Very few shallow groundwater bores. The region's underlain by the GOB, which is a more reliable source, and that's been, I guess, where the effort has been in terms of sinking bores and doing research and understanding things there. Previous research in some of the area led by Justin Costello has shown that a lot of the water holes are not groundwater fed, so there's some water holes that are quite long lasting, but they seem to be disconnected to the surrounding groundwater that has been shown to be there, and that groundwater is often very saline, hypersaline sort of thing, and the water holes get lined by clay, so they're almost like a bath there. There's also large coal deposits underlying some of this region, and those have been the subject of some interest for development, which would no doubt have impacts on groundwater and surface water in the area, particularly as those coal deposits underlie the GOB. So, as part of a larger project to improve knowledge about the Lake Eyre Basin and its water, Juna developed a project that would answer 3 key questions in this area, which is what is the distribution and the characteristics of shallow groundwater in these floodplain landscapes? How connected is the shallow groundwater to deeper groundwater, such as the GOB? And to what degree are the riparian and floodplain ecosystems dependent on shallow groundwater? And the project focused on this western Lake Eyre Basin region, which you can see in a little map down the corner there. So an ideal project, there's a really good paper about how you determine groundwater dependency of vegetation, and one of the nice features of that is you might have a tree here and you take some samples from your tree and you stick a bore down right next to the tree and you take samples of the soil water as you go down, and if you hit groundwater, you know there's groundwater there. We weren't able to do any drilling as part of the project, so we had to sample existing bores there, which were sampled for hydrochemistry and some isotope work. So Mark Keppel led that side of the project, and he picked out 19 sites there up in this western Lake Eyre Basin region. So we sampled from, weren't able to implement all the methods at every site. We sampled 15 wells, collected water from 2 water holes. We had leaf and water soil potential monitoring at 6 sites. This is soil sampling was collected by hand, so we couldn't go particularly deep, but we went as far as we could under the conditions. And we had 6 sap flow monitoring sites, 6 months of sap flow monitoring data from 5 sites, as well as some previous data that had been collected in the Finke region. And we looked at some key species, being the river red gums, coolabars, gidgeys and river coobars. And there's also a desktop component to the project, which University of Adelaide led some remote sensing imagery analysis, and they presented that at the last conference. And we did used a literature review and the knowledge gained from this project to put together hydroecological conceptual models, which look pretty complicated there, but we had some better ones down the track, or better for communication purposes. And our field sampling was in November 2015. So some of the interesting results that we found were that the trees that were out there, so it was a very dry period, there hadn't been much rain at all for the year leading into that, and so we encountered very low leaf water potentials. So leaf water potential, the more negative we see there, usually that means the less water the tree has available to it. And yet these trees were very healthy. So we found no correlation between low leaf water potential and tree health, which has been found to occur in the River Murray region across similar leaf water potential ranges. If you saw trees that healthy on the River Murray floodplain, you'd be pretty excited about it. And these 2 trees are growing in about 1 metre of soil over hard rock, and no obvious groundwater existing at that site at all. Some of the other interesting results were with the sap flow monitoring, is that it appears that the trees undertake what we call hydraulic redistribution. And so you can see that circle there is showing that when there was a rainfall event, the sap flow reversed, and that we think the trees are redistributing water around in the soil. Ultimately, what we found is that no situations of complete groundwater dependence existed. So across most of the sites, basically the trees use whatever water is available at the site, and they exist across this spectrum of surface water and groundwater situations. They have opportunistic water use strategies, and total reliance on groundwater is unlikely for any one species. For the hydrogeologists amongst you, we did find that there were 3 distinct groundwater sources, which you would expect. The JK aquifer of the GOB, there's a shallow quaternary aquifer, and the Hamilton subbasin, and these are all quite disconnected. And ultimately, although we're not able to have huge confidence in the results because we had limited sampling, we undertook a basic vulnerability assessment, which led us to believe that these ecosystems are probably less susceptible to groundwater impacts, but they would be more susceptible to surface water impacts in these sites. And if you would like to learn more about that, including the groundwater components, there's 2 reports. There's the summary report and the supplementary report there, and they're available on Water Connect.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Catherine.